Alright, hello, my name is Daniel Finney, and this is a video about... Could you just hear my dog bark? Hold up really quick. No, Kelly, up here. Hey. Chill. Okay, you might see her behind me. This is a video about gun control and how it relates to suicide. So, starting things off, gun control is a very interesting topic because it can spark a very fierce conversation in people, as it is something that people get very emotionally invested in. And when I chose this topic, I was interested in gun control as a whole. But when I got more into it, I realized, well, we couldn't do the entire thing. That's too broad of a subject. So I chose to do mine about suicide and how it relates to gun control. With my topic, it is very easy to immediately choose a bias on this area, because people, one way or another, have been influenced by this topic, and whether that's through violent crime, whether that's through a family member or friend committing suicide, it is something that we can get very emotionally invested in, and sometimes it is very hard for us to look at the facts about it. And I know it was, even for me just doing my paper, it was so hard for me to look at this subject from a very intellectual point of view and not to put any of my emotions into it. And it was actually quite interesting to see my thoughts on this subject change. And so this is what I will be kind of discussing. So let's get right into it. So to start off the entire conversation, we need to look at what they have already tried to do in relation to what laws they have implemented in with gun control and how it affected suicide in those countries. So one of the two things that I need to talk about first is Wales, England. And they did a study there where there was some gun control laws that were put into place, and the amount of guns in the country drastically decreased because of the laws. But then the thing is that in this country, it was a good example to see that change actually did have incredibly positive effects on suicide rates there. But then you can look at a different country, and another country that has a good living wage and not a third world country. Like a first world country is Canada. And Canada implemented some gun control laws, and those laws made the amount of guns for civilians decrease. But then in Canada, we didn't see a decrease in suicide rates. It just changed from firearm suicide rates to a different type of suicide. And from that, we can draw on the conclusion that no two countries are going to even be the same. And it's important to look at other countries that are considered first world countries when talking about that, because that would be the closest to what represents the United States. A big part as to why it will help in some countries and why it won't in other countries is part of their culture. And that is something that is the biggest thing that I came across while researching this topic, was looking at the culture of that specific area. And you can't just look at other countries and say that it worked there, because in some countries it did work, in some countries it didn't work. That's just how it went. There's a lot of research to show that. There are research that shows some countries with drastically less guns still have the same amount of suicide rate. And you can see that in this right here. That shows that it's not just a one-to-one thing with the amount of guns increase. If that increases, then suicide rates increase as well. And if that decreases, then that decreases as well. So, like I already stated, culture is the main thing that we need to focus on in these specific studies, and why did those things help and why did those things not help. And specifically, we need to start looking at the United States and to see how it would affect us. And there are several non-drastic laws that we have already researched and we have already proven that would be extremely beneficial, and those are the types of laws that are not going to hinder people from protecting themselves, but they're actually going to allow that, but then also decrease suicide rates. And so first, the law that I would propose to put into place would be something called the gun locks rule. And the gun locks rule, what is my dog doing? Is something that basically states that if you have children in a household, you need to have a gun lock on your guns. And that can mean, generally, it means a per gun thing. So if you have a pistol, there needs to be something around that pistol that locks it. And so only the parent would have access to the key or the code or whatever that may be to unlock that. Or if you have maybe a lot of guns, that means putting it into a gun locker. This has shown excellent outcomes. And in 18 states that introduced the gun locks law, there was an 8.3% decline in teen suicides. And that doesn't sound like a huge number, but that is absolutely a step in the right direction that is calculable. And it's just going to be these kind of laws that are going to allow us to go in a step in a right direction. And if there was a 5%, if there was less than that, but if there was something that we could see from this law that was actually beneficial, then I totally believe that we should put that into effect, because that is not hindering people from protecting themselves. If they were to carry that in public, they could still do that if they had a concealed carry license. And if there was a home invader, they could still get to their guns. There are people that train people to protect themselves and quickly access those guns. And so that is not going to hinder anyone to be able to protect themselves. Second is a universal background check. This is something that has already been passed in 11 states. And what a universal background check is, just it's something that requires, it's a law that requires background checks for any sale of a gun. And the reason that that is important, because the current state of background checks is they're only federally required at federally licensed gun dealers. And so this means going into a gun shop, you would have to get a background check. And so that's on all types of guns. And that is actually a common misconception, that you can go into a gun shop and get a gun without a background check. And that's not how that works. But the problem is that I could go online right now to something like Craigslist, and I could find someone that is selling a gun. And if my state didn't require a background check for private owners of guns, I could walk to the person, pay him in cash, and then get that gun. So I am proposing that we implement something called the universal background check, and this is something that has been talked about for a long time. And from what I've seen, the harms from it are very minimal, and especially when it comes to suicide rates, it is something that can actually be very beneficial, because the hidden benefit of a background check, normally when you're talking about a background check, you are talking about violent crimes and keeping criminals away from getting guns. But the background check has actually been shown to decrease suicide rates, especially in the age group of 55 and older. And the reason that this is because a background check adds a waiting time into the mix. And so the longer that a person has to wait for a gun, if that is the way that they have chosen to commit suicide, then the higher the chance is that they are going to rethink that and make a different decision. And hopefully the goal is to get them to choose not to commit suicide and get help. And so that is something that would just be immediately beneficial to not only violent gun crimes, but actually suicide rates as well. And the last thing adding on to this is actually just a kind of an add-on to the background check. And this is something that I would not be able to give you exact numbers, and we would need more research on, but it's adding on to the time that it takes for a background check to go through. And this has some downsides of maybe you want to get that gun as soon as possible for whatever reason. But in terms of suicide rates, this has been shown to be incredibly beneficial, because there was a study done that showed only 10 to 15% of people actually have a unbreakable determination to kill themselves. And this means that the longer that we can get people to not do it, and if we can just get them to keep going a couple more days, drastically increases the chance that they will choose not to commit suicide. And that is just another thing that I propose that we can implement to decrease suicide rates in America. The last thing I need to talk about is something called the Dickey Amendment. And this is something I found when I was researching this topic, and it came up in kind of a surprising, or not a surprising way, but when I was researching, I found so many articles from the past that were talking about studies, and there was a lot less research done recently about gun violence. And this absolutely shocked me when I was researching, because gun control is such a thing that is talked about so often in media, and you see it everywhere through social media. If you log on to Facebook, you'll hear people talking about it. If you watch the news, you'll hear people talking about it. And this was just really surprising to me. And when I was digging into why that is, I found something called the Dickey Amendment. And the Dickey Amendment, this is a quote, it says, the amendment states that none of the funds made available for injury prevention and control at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention may be used to advocate or promote gun control. So in its wording, it's stating that they basically cannot do biased research. They're saying that they cannot just do research that promotes gun control. And this sounds like something that is somewhat of a reasonable request. They don't want them to do biased research on this topic that would only support one side. The actual effect of this amendment that was passed was that the CDC decreased their spending on research of gun violence by 96%. By 96%. So they had gone from that being one of their main focuses, and this is in 1993, and that's why I could not find as many articles from more present times, and especially the ones that I did find, they were mostly from other countries, right? And the ones in America are somewhat outdated. There are studies that you can find, because 96%, there are still studies being done, and not just by the CDC. But the $2.6 million that they were previously investing, they put all of that into brain trauma injury. And this drastically slowed down the research that they were doing on this topic. And from my own research into gun control and suicide, this is something that I found to be incredibly harmful to the state of this argument. And even Jay Dickey himself actually later stated that he regrets making or representing the amendment because he saw the harm that it did to the conversation. And so this is something that I believe on either side of the argument, if you are pro-Second Amendment or pro-gun control, that you would get behind increasing research onto this topic, because all of us are looking for the truth about this and trying to see what would be the most beneficial thing for America as a whole, and not just for one demographic or the other, but truly as a country. We need to find out what is going to be the most beneficial thing for us. And this is something that would be so hard to do if we don't have modern studies on it and studying the culture that we currently have to be able to tell us what would happen if we got rid of a lot of guns, or if we implemented this law to help. There's no way of knowing that. And so I propose, my final thing is that we get rid of the Dickey Amendment and we encourage the United States to do a lot more bipartisan research in this topic, and so that we can get unbiased research on this and not just cherry picked anything like that. We need unbiased research to tell us the actual truth about this subject. So that is it. That is what I have found through my research, and I hope that was very informative to you. I learned so much during this time, and my goal for this video was just to get people to make a decision for themselves. And if you agree with what I've said in this video, then maybe you can look into it even more, and you can come up with that decision, or even add to the argument yourself. I highly suggest that you always are looking into each of these topics and researching them, because there's so many things that are just thrown out there that actually, from my findings, have been very, not false necessarily, but very cherry-picked, like using cherry-picked data. And like, for the example of the European country, and a bunch of different countries, there are things that would support gun control, and there are things that would support the Second Amendment. But you find so many people that are just cherry-picking data, and that's why we need to look at the entire state of the matter as a whole, and not just at specific countries and only looking at things that are going to support your claim. And that's all I got. So I appreciate you so much for watching, and if you like this video, give it a big thumbs up, and let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you. Bye.